Hi, this is State Delegate Janelle Wilkins from District 20 in Montgomery County, and you're listening to the Conduit Street podcast, the best source of news and notes on Maryland politics and policy. The Conduit Street podcast, the official podcast of the Maryland Association of Counties.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street podcast. Kevin Canale here with Michael Sanderson and with Sarah Sample today. We're going to talk about education policy. And Sarah and Michael, before we get into exactly what we're going to cover today, it is September 19th and it feels perilously close to the 2025 legislative session. I don't know about you two. Feels like we just got off the summer conference and now we're really getting into session prep mode, but also we have our winter conference coming up. So it really just never stops. How are you both feeling?
It definitely feels a little ominous. And I found an interesting thing this session from my interim conversations. Everyone has sort of like a different time frame for when they start saying next session versus this session. And there's that ominous feeling that comes with this session, and everyone has that moment. And I think for me, I started saying next session, I think right after our summer conference, because it just feels like everything accelerates at that point. And it just goes from 0 to 60. So yeah, I've crossed the threshold and now I'm saying this session.
I like the idea that a Maryland legislative session has sort of an event horizon that's unescapable, like a black hole. Like once you come home from the MACo conference in the middle of August, now we're into the next year officially, and there's no going back. There's no return. It's a one way ticket. And it totally feels that way.
Yeah, no doubt. I was talking to a legislator yesterday, and she told me that there are at least 850 pre-filed bills and requests. So gear up. It's coming. And today, we're going to really dive in and discuss education policy in Maryland, specifically what we see looking back on the past 5 years of the blueprint. And we've talked a lot about the blueprint. We'll get into that and use that to assess where we are now and where we feel like we are going and should be going. But before we get into it, I'm going to ask Michael to take us back in time. You and I were there at the blueprint's conception and for all of those long all day subcommittee meetings. Talk about, what that was like in the early on and really this podcast launched, I think, because of the Kerwin Commission and then the blueprint.
Yeah, I think that's the fair telling of the story. I think most people know this history generally, and I don't think this needs to be a 20-minute sidelight or a standalone episode over on the Patreon site or anything. But I mean, the short version is, before there was the law that we now call the blueprint, there was a commission formed with a whole wide range of stakeholders, chaired by Britt Kerwin, who was a former chancellor at the University of Maryland. As Maryland is wont to do, we named the commission after the chair, so it became the Kerwin Commission. But they spent sort of close to 3 years working through all these sort of ideas for how Maryland could transform education and set a new path and so forth. And definitely that was at the same time that, Kevin, you and I were on the ground floor trying to build sort of an extra way to reach our own audience in the county world, in addition to our blog and newsletter and other things like that. We had done a county officials conference call during the legislative session, and that sort of evolved into, let's try this as a podcast, and maybe 50 people will listen to a MACo podcast. But we ended up basically saying, hey, the hottest ticket in town is the Kerwin Commission meetings, and they've got work groups and breakout sessions almost every week. So we're going and attending these meetings and following what's going on, and then trying to distill what we had gathered through all that work on the podcast. So you and I going back and forth, and you might have attended one work group and I attended the different work group, and we come back and sort of compare notes on the air. And that turned into a brand that I think a lot of Maryland policy people really appreciated, that we were covering those discussions, I think, in more depth and detail than anybody else at the time. And that sort of became, the way we built out this podcast, the way we want to just talk about policy that we think is interesting and relevant, and people will listen to it.
Yes. And, there was never a lack of content, that's for sure, during those days. I mean, you're right. There were, the subcommittees and the full committee meetings, and it was over years. So there was a lot to get through. I think we did a good job of breaking it down. I think we covered it more than anyone else. I agree with you, but it was a lot. And here we are today. The podcast is still rolling, and now we are implementing the blueprint. So catching up on kind of how we got here and what Maryland hoped to accomplish with the blueprint. And Michael, I'll start with you. And then Sarah, I want to get your perspective too, as someone who just jumped in to covering the education portfolio and is confronted with this behemoth of the blueprint.
I mean, I think the big picture, we're mostly familiar with it. And I think sometimes the counties get a little flack because we're not really engaged in the delivery of education services. The counties are really just asked to fund education. But the mission here is one that's really engaging and impressive. The idea that Maryland is a high wealth state in the potentially the most successful economy in the world, we ought to be having better outcomes from our public education system than we are. We're in a number of ways, we had fallen from a top tier of outcomes in public schools in Maryland. And when you look at the United States or Maryland compared to other parts of the world, there's ways we could do a lot better. And how do you achieve that? A lot of experts, a lot of folks who have invested a ton of time into this sort of guided this Maryland process, saying you got to do a number of different things. You need to provide more support for the kids and the schools that really need it. You have to do right by our students who have special needs. You'd be well served by trying to invest in the teaching profession and make it more attractive and more of a destination for our highest performing students. And then, a variety of things sort of within the school systems and better outcomes and so forth in the programs that we're investing in. And then on the back end, try and make sure that there's accountability so that as you roll the program out, you don't end up missing the mark 10 years later. And there were kind of whispers that the last big Maryland education initiative, the Thornton Commission, that turned into its own legislation, might have failed on that accountability guidance. So you bundle all that sort of stuff together, and the idea is, how do we break through the roof and become the absolute national and even world leader in public education, what you ask of it? So that's, if you buy in at that level, the mission is a pretty noble one, and a lot of states elsewhere have taken notice of what Maryland's trying to do.
Yes, I agree. And a lot of great things in the blueprint. Certainly, we are a high wealth state in the most successful economy in the world. And so we should have a world-class education system. And that was the goal. That is the goal. And the blueprint, the Kirwan Commission looked at a lot of other countries. They had a consultant, pages and pages and pages of results, data, things like that they were trying to work through. And eventually you got to the final product after all the subcommittees did their work. And then you get into passing legislation, overriding a veto. You have the COVID pandemic, and then you're finally into the rollout, into the implementation, right? So Sarah, as someone now who is just jumping in, you've seen some of the rollout. You haven't been with MACo for too long, and you certainly haven't covered education as a primary coverage for too long. But now you're seeing the rollout. You're talking to all the stakeholders. You're really diving into everything. I mean, what have your impressions been so far, and especially looking at COVID? I mean, how do you feel like COVID impacted the blueprint, in its rollout, and then where we are even today?
Yeah, well, as far as getting into the education portfolio, I mean, even without the blueprint, education's a sprawling category, and the blueprint on top of that is a really big plan. And to be fair, I totally asked for it. Michael can attest. I wanted to get into education, but it's a really important category. And I like having those ones. I want to be close to those important conversations that are sometimes difficult. But I think that nonpartisan perspective needs to be brought to some of those issues, similar to with my corrections issues. I've got that in the public safety portfolio, and I think sometimes these things are hard to talk about, but they're vital conversations, particularly to have from that non-political angle. So it's a big category. I'm diving into it, and I want to be looking into this. But I guess as far as how I think it's going, I've been doing what I'm terming a listening tour. I want to hear from our members and external stakeholders. I think pretty obviously it's important to not consider the issue in a vacuum. And so I'm talking with everyone, and that's been my priority, and well ahead of session. So that means meeting with, the chairs of the budget and tax and the appropriations committees, and then their education subcommittee chairs. And then you've got the chairs of Ways and Means and EEE, and then their education subcommittee chairs. And then you go outside of the General Assembly, and it's the governor's team. It's the Maryland State Department of Education and the Superintendents Association and the boards of education. And it sounds like a lot, and it is, but I think that's the only way to get really like truly grounded in the material. And so, outside of having those conversations with stakeholders, I'm just totally going down into a rabbit hole of what's happened over the last 5 years on implementation, because I really feel like you got to look back to sort of be clear about looking forward ultimately. And I think COVID really did complicate a lot of that. And we can talk about that as we get into some of the pillars.
Yeah, and I think like learning the language, like the education language is difficult enough, and how people talk about certain things. And Michael, let's talk about the timeline and how this was supposed to roll out, and then some of the complications right up front, and then where we are now, because we're about 3 years into, I guess, the official rollout.
Right. And the clock management on this 10-year process has been a little bit quirky, because the way the whole blueprint plan got adopted by the General Assembly was kind of in fits and starts. They launched some initial items in 2020. They had some more pieces in 2021. There was sort of some ratchet and clank action with, making some adjustments in timing. And as a result of the pandemic effect on student enrollment, we had to make some adjustments right away. But as a practical matter, it's nominally a 10-year plan. And the idea is we're going to phase in various components of this big, broad plan on individual timelines that are embedded within the whole 10 years. So it's not every component is 10% at a time for each of 10 years. Rather, there's some things that are supposed to arrive in year 3 and some things that are supposed to arrive in year 5 and so forth. So where we are nominally is we're in fiscal 2025. And I think the reasonable calculation is that that's year 3 out of 10. So 23, 24, and 25 were the first 3 years where these calculations actually ended up guiding state funding. They ended up guiding what's obligated by the county to come up with. And we've kind of talked here and so forth about how those calculations work. I don't think we need to get into that right at the moment, but those are the mechanics, that we are in year 3 of the 10-year plan, and still 7 more to go. So you arrive around FY 2032 is sort of the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, so to speak.
Right. And you mentioned a few times that the county role in this is essentially we're the funding partner, right? We don't have any say in policy. Counties fund schools with the state. And so in that way, you talk about COVID happening and schools shifting to a virtual environment. Obviously, that shifts a lot of things, including costs. So I think right off the bat, there was a lot of turbulence coming out of the gate where things were more expensive. I mean, we had all these charts before the pandemic, and it had, here's the county contribution from county A, B, C, D, and then you completely shift to a new environment. The whole world is different. So from a county government perspective, I think you can throw those old charts out the window, Michael, in terms of what things were supposed to cost, versus where we are now. And I think a lot of that is understandable. We had a global pandemic. Everything is different. Things are more expensive. The labor force has changed. So I think from a county government perspective, when you just looked at the fiscal implications, things are a lot different, even after sort of a shaky rollout.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And you're right. It's not merely like the most obvious effect on public education during the health crisis in 2020 and for a while thereafter was enrollment, right? You immediately saw in the fall of 2020, virtually all public schools went to some sort of online offering, and you had a variety of responses. You had a lot of students in the public schools, okay, somebody sent us a Chromebook and now we can log in and we'll take the class electronically and so forth. But we know that some families decided, okay, we're going to just choose a different option. We're going to homeschool. We're going to find a private education that'll be in person because we prefer that. So you ended up with a dip in overall enrollment in the public school system, both in enrollment and attendance. And that ends up being, I mean, it's the fuel for every formula is how many students fund this many dollars. So when you have fewer students, suddenly it's like, well, what do? Do you end up like just cutting school funding by 10% because a bunch of kids are doing things differently? And that was, the first crisis to handle. But the less obvious stuff is the shocks that we saw in the labor market broadly. I mean, there was a giant crisis with school bus drivers. Remember, we went through a window of time where you just couldn't find enough people to drive buses, just who had the license and so forth. So the shock in the labor system, and then what ended up being an overall shock in equipment and supplies and building the buildings and maintenance and so forth. It's just all those things it's been a course correction for sure.
Right. Course correction, I think, is putting it lightly. So, I mean, COVID, it did impact everything. And obviously the rollout was a little shaky, but considering all the complications just discussed, Sarah, I mean, let's talk about the phase in and let's do it by pillar. There are different pillars that are part of this blueprint plan. So let's talk about the blueprint implementation plans and tell us about the challenges around the 5 pillars. And Sarah, I'll start with you on pillar 1, which is pre-K education.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, I think the most compelling pieces of information we have to go on right now are the blueprint implementation plans that are sent in by every one of our jurisdictions multiple times a year. And these are dense documents with qualitative and quantitative information telling the Accountability and Implementation Board how progress is going on each of these pillars. And truly, this is more accountability than has ever been seen. These are really, really dense reports. But those plans include challenges and successes around the 5 pillars. So if you start with pillar number 1, early childhood education, you see the big topic there is pre-kindergarten. We were hoping for a 50-50 split on covering the pre-K expansion between school-based and private providers. It's called a mixed delivery system. When there wasn't a ton of engagement off the bat from the private side, that 50-50 got shifted. And I believe it was last session or maybe the one before, the 50-50 was changed to a goal and not a mandate or requirement. And that was with the understanding that schools might be taking on more of that capacity. But from a complication perspective, right now, the challenges are different across every jurisdiction. But I think the ones that rise to the top for schools are getting the staff that meet those blueprint certification requirements and space for that many new kids. And then sort of externally for the private providers, stakeholder engagement has been a little sporadic and slower than expected. So having all the available slots ready according to the timeline seems like it's going to be a little bit tight. But I would say from what I hear, the information is starting to get through, and new providers are digging in and figuring out what it takes to be certified by MSDE, the Maryland State Department of Education, as a pre-K provider. And then that's even for existing certified facilities that are expanding. So like, for instance, in Montgomery County, there's an organization called Centronia opening a new early childhood education center in what is essentially called a child care desert. And they've been certified by MSDE in their Tacoma Park location. So we could start seeing more of that to fill some seats. But yeah, Pillar 1 has been a little bit rocky.
Right. And I think part of that, thinking back, Kevin and I to those early podcasts and those early meetings of the Kerwin Commission that led to the blueprint legislation. I mean, the vision had always been, we will make it attractive enough for private providers who are doing basically just daycare today for 3 and 4 year olds. We'll make it attractive enough that basically the market will provide us with all sorts of private providers who will convert from just doing daycare to becoming full-on educators. They'll go through whatever training and certification and so forth will be required that they can become educators. We're going to give kids pre-K instruction at 3 and 4, not just somebody watching them and keeping them safe. And in all candor, the idea that things are starting to happen on that front is good news, but it certainly didn't happen as rapidly as I think the commission had envisioned. So the timetable was, this is going to ramp up quick over the first 3 or 4 years. We're going to ramp up to where we're getting first the poorest kids and then more kids, and we're going to have this 50-50 split of public and private. The private didn't post. And so right. Like that's just like the reality on the ground. So we're hopefully getting there. But that has been one of the first big things you had to adjust for in the real world.
Yeah, and that's where the shift came back into the schools.
Yes, and I remember, during those meetings and conversations around the 50-50 split, and I remember feeling like, that's a little bullish, because not only do you have these private providers, right now, good luck finding daycare, right? So really these private providers are finding, I think, that they can make more without going through a certification process, without having to be Excel's certified right at the state level. And I feel like, they just didn't step up and do that. A lot of that, of course, the pandemic influenced it, but it is good to hear that now they're stepping up because, consistently what I've heard across counties is that, hey, no one's stepping up to do this. Our schools don't have enough space to accommodate all these new kids, and we're kind of just stuck and we don't know what to do. So I think for 3-year-old pre-K, especially, like, that's not happening, right? And it's just, it's not because no one wants it to happen. It's literally, you don't have enough providers, you don't have enough space. The public schools can't handle it. They just don't have the physical space. So certainly good to hear that things are maybe moving in a positive direction there.
Well, and to your point, Kevin, about the capacity thing, like, so that Centrania location in Montgomery County, that is a bright spot, but the other side of what we're hearing in terms of their opening is that they already have a wait list of over 1,000 people. So the capacity thing,
right.
So progress is being made, but in terms of the timeline, maybe not quickly enough.
I mean, I have small children, and I know, friends and friends of friends trying to find childcare, people waiting in line starting at like 3 a.m. just for 1 or 2 slots at a daycare provider. It's crazy, right? So it's still really in demand, and obviously it costs more money when the market is this thin in terms of providers. So that's challenging too. As we move into the second pillar, this was a huge focus of the Kerwin Commission, and now subsequently the blueprint. Michael, let's talk about staffing. Let's talk about career ladders, and really what we're getting into is compensating educators for the services they provide and really elevating that profession generally, right? That's the goal.
Right. And that's well said. A lot of time in the lead up to the legislation, experts coming to Maryland and saying that this is a foundational part of having better outcomes in your schools is you want to create, being a teacher, being an in-classroom teacher, not just someone involved in the system, but an in-classroom teacher as a prestige profession. I remember we heard about parity with engineers. Like, we heard that particular analogy all the time, that we want some of our best and brightest, high school juniors and college sophomores, as they're thinking about career paths and majors and what to focus in academically. We want them to be thinking about the prospects of being an educator in the same way they say, well, I want to get the training so I can be an engineer. And that's a good, stable, productive, reliable, pillar of the community type person. That educators should be the same thing. We should get some of our kids, instead of going to Wall Street, they should be coming to the high school. And so, how do you do that? It's a number of different things. There's elements in the legislation about a career ladder, and that includes a couple different components, but among them, we want to see more of our teachers get fully certificated. It's kind of a weird term. I think certified, but it sounds like the folks in the trade call it certificated.
Certificated.
Right.
Certificated.
So to get a national teaching certificate is a pretty rigorous process, and sometimes it'll take people several years on the job with spending extra time with extra training while they're working. If you want to get more folks to do that, you provide an incentive, and that's built into the career ladder concept of, once you get your full teacher certificate, you get a guaranteed bump in your minimum salary. So the state has never told an individual school system or an individual school, you have to pay this teacher that many dollars. This is the first time the state has kind of done that. Another piece of it is, if we want to provide incentives for teachers to teach in areas that have been underserved, that have some of the kids that are hardest to reach, hardest to teach. So we'll provide an incentive there. Maybe you get an extra $7,000 if you're willing to go teach on that side of town or in that school that has the real difficulties and so forth. So some steps along the way as you progress as a teacher. Another piece at the end of the line, we wanted to create a path for master teachers. The frustration was lots of people who have been in the classroom and they're outstanding. They've been doing this for 17 years. And then they find, I'm basically capped in my career unless I become an administrator. and I might be able to get a salary increase by becoming an administrator, but then I won't have time to be an outstanding teacher, and that's really what I would prefer to do. So making sure there's a channel for a veteran, outstanding classroom teacher to advance and do some mentoring and do some leadership, but stay in the classroom principally, was a path as well. And then probably the best known piece of this is by around midway through the phase in of this blueprint, the state said, we got to make sure every teacher comes in at a salary of $60,000 minimum. And, our various jurisdictions are in various places on their way toward that goal. But that's just around the corner. The 60K minimum salary comes pretty soon. Part of the theory there was to create some regional parity, so you don't have folks from Western Maryland being dragged down to Montgomery or a place like that, or to Howard, just to pursue higher salaries. I'm not sure that'll be the final outcome. I think what we might see is that if yesterday's 54 becomes 60, then yesterday's 62 has to become 69 or 71 or whatever. There may be some compression up the wage scale as well, and that might not have been in the arithmetic for the original. But the plan here was make teaching a prestige profession in Maryland, and we'll get some of the best and brightest here, but also from Pennsylvania and from Colorado, and they'll come and teach here.
Right. So a few points there, Michael. So first of all, I mean, on the pay, I think there is a legitimate conversation to be had about, cost of living in Somerset versus cost of living in Potomac in Montgomery County, right? So I think there were a lot of conversations about how to do that. But certainly, on your point, you didn't want to create a situation where you had people being dragged from the eastern or western shore to the center of the state where they could potentially make more. But I'll tell you right now, and a lot of it's due to COVID and not having enough teachers in the pipeline or applying, that you're seeing that cannibalization right now, particularly, Anne Arundel, Howard County, teachers, there's a huge battle going on right now in terms of pay and trying to attract the best and brightest teachers. And that's understandable. But another piece of this, Michael, was we're going to make sure that teachers have more professional development time, which I think is fantastic, right? And it all lends itself to the career ladder concept. But what that means is that you're going to need to hire more teachers. Then the pandemic happens. Now we're hearing school systems say, hey, it's really hard to find teachers. And we need more of them. So that absolutely has to complicate things as well, right?
And without a doubt, right? I mean, this is the labor market we face in almost every area, but certainly in education, is way different than the experts who were sharpening their pencils back in 2017, 18, 19 to try and build this plan. None of those experts were looking at a labor market that even resembles what we face today, for sure.
Right. So no one's fault, but certainly, you look at the way things were supposed to go, life happens, things go wild, and now we are where we are. I want to pivot to the next pillar for the sake of time. And Sarah, let's get into the third pillar. And why don't you talk about that, what that's all about?
Yeah. So the third pillar is the college and career readiness track. And that has complications on the college side and the career side. So if you start with the college side, the thing is, and I'd say no major surprise, is that the kids that are ready to start taking advantage of dual enrollment courses, which are offered by this pillar of the blueprint, the kids that are able to start taking those courses at the end of the 10th grade are very well resourced kids with a lot of the supports in place in school and at home. But because of a lot of participation, those programs got capped last session because it ended up being more money than was accounted for based on the formula. So the General Assembly did make an adjustment and cap the amount of capital flowing through that program by allowing schools to limit the number of credits available per semester. So in essence, and I think this starts to speak to pillar number 4, you had very well resourced kids taking advantage of the opportunity. And then now less availability for resources overall in that opportunity. So when it comes to pillar 4 and parity for all students, that piece is not yet reaching the kids who really can take advantage of having the K through 12 system subsidize the cost of higher education. And in many circumstances, just because they aren't in a position to start going down the college and career readiness track at the end of 10th grade. So that's sort of on the college side. And then quickly on the career and apprenticeship side, the major issue that has been brought to light on that side is that many of the rural areas, there are not enough apprenticeships for the number of students that need them. And I think they are finding workarounds, trying to find some virtual options and transportation. But I think virtual and transportation are going to need to play a big role there. But progress is being made on those fronts. But yeah, they've run into some tricky situations with the rollout on those elements.
Yeah, and maybe I'm a ghoul, but I cover fiscal issues at MACo. And Sarah, there's also a question about who pays for it, right? We have these dual enrollment pathways, and we're partnering with community colleges, the schools are. But of course, this question comes up of, well, who pays for these extra services? Who pays for a kid to go to the community college? Who pays for the transportation to get the kid to a community college? There's that question that's still out there too, right?
Yeah, and my understanding is that there are some stakeholders that are holding some work groups right now to try and figure out how to stabilize some of those costs so that it's a little bit more uniform across the board and to get a little bit more clarity on how the payment flows, essentially.
Yeah, and it was really good to see the Kerwin Commission, look at apprenticeships and acknowledge that not every kid needs to go to college, and that we need to ensure that kids are on the right pathway. It's disheartening to hear that we don't have enough apprenticeships still. I'm sure, again, I hate to keep going back to the pandemic, but that certainly plays a role. But it is good to know that we're elevating sort of these other professions that don't require a college degree and trying to stomp out that stigma, because we all know the stigma is still there and it shouldn't be, right? So, so complications there. Theme of this is that the rollout has been tough, and there have been a lot of external factors as to why. Michael, let's get into the next one. And the next one that we have is the accountability pillar, and that's been a huge focus for county governments and school boards. There's been a lot of talk about accountability. It's a big part of the blueprint on purpose. The Kerwin Commission really believed that accountability was very important, especially when you're going to spend all this extra money. It has to come with accountability. So, Michael, from your perspective, how has this gone? We've had legislation dealing with this after the rollout, and where are we today?
All right. So I think Sarah already explained the reports that are already the implementation reports coming from each school system are the most obvious marker that accountability is going to be different for this phase of state extra investment in education. It shows up in multiple ways, but among them, is it twice a year the school systems have to submit their own progress report?
I don't think that it's always twice a year. I think this year it was twice a year. It's at least once. So
okay, right. So there's going to be regular reports coming from each jurisdiction that should give the state some degree of ability to flag a problem before it gets severe. I mean, I think that's part of what you want at that level, is if a jurisdiction is saying, hey, we're trying to do this complete schools rollout and we're having difficulty with this particular facet, so it hasn't been implemented the way we want it to. And then the following year, they're still having trouble with it. Rather than this being a 7-year problem, maybe you can go in year 2 and say, let's transfer some resources or send some staffing or get a consultant in the room or something to try and untangle what they haven't been able to sort out. So that regular reporting upward from the local school systems to the state, I think, is a hallmark of that. The state created an entirely new body to oversee the rollout of the blueprint. So the State Board of Education already has sort of a defined role and its own lane as far as general guidance for curriculum and standards and all the things that keep the whole education program across the state, pointed in the right direction. There's an awful lot of local autonomy, but the State Board of Education makes a variety of global and strategic decisions on behalf of the whole statewide system. Rather than have this be one more thing for that body to also be tasked with, the blueprint legislation said, let's make sure we have a team of experts on the blueprint who are familiar with and committed to the goals of the blueprint and can be more hands-on with those reports from the local systems, with the progress from the local systems on what's happening there. So that's its own thing. Sadly, though, as we talk about where we are so far, it took a little longer than expected to get this accountability and implementation board and its staff really up and running. And their staff really have only been ramped up in the last 6 or 9 months. So when you got through year 1 and year 2 of the blueprint, you started seeing things in law saying this report will be done by such and such a date in 2023 or in 2024. And the reality was, well, we didn't even have the board in place to issue the guidance. So no one can be expected to have matched, to have responded correctly by a certain date. So we've seen some of those intermediate measurement dates pushed back. Again, I don't think this is anybody's malfeasance. It was just the reality was a little tougher than it seemed on pieces of paper back in 2018. And one last piece is there is a staff person in each jurisdiction titled an implementation coordinator, supposed to be sort of the czar for managing the rollout across each county level school district. And the law specifically had that person jointly appointed by the school board and the county governing body. So even though county governments aren't really asked to manage schools or make decisions on curriculum or other sort of, education functional decisions, the state wanted to have county officials engaged at the rollout level and part of the oversight process. So to jointly appoint the person who's quarterbacking the whole thing was a kind of a significant thing. Some of our jurisdictions were like, why are we being brought in on this? This isn't really our bag. But that was by design. It's a feature, not a bug, to have counties in on the sort of oversight process. Controversial. The oversight issues sometimes turn into, well, who has control at the tiny level, and do the counties want to determine what color pencils we buy and stuff like that. But in reality, the big picture on implementation is a huge investment in education should be going to the things that we're trying to accomplish through the blueprint, and that's got its upside. It also has caused some friction.
Yeah, and Michael, to your point about the oversight, I think one of the other tricky elements was sort of you've got two oversight bodies there. You've got the State Department of Education and you've got the AIB. And I think for a period of time, those two entities getting their dance steps together while, the MSD is having a change in leadership. And then you've got the AIB still getting up to speed and getting their staff in place. That also, I think, threw like an additional wrench into some things.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And, Michael, you mentioned some friction about making sure the money goes where it's intended to go on the upside there, but also some downsides. I mean, one of the things we hear from school boards is that they don't have enough flexibility, right? That the blueprint is too prescriptive and that they need flexibility. One size does not fit all. Sounds familiar, right? One size does not fit all. And so we're seeing these school boards saying, hey, we don't need to put all of this money into bucket A because we really need the money in bucket C. But by law, by the blueprint, we have to put the money in bucket A. So we really need some flexibility. And I think it's because of that and several other stakeholders expressing concerns. And you heard about all the challenges with the rollout so far. I think that's why there's so much buzz in Annapolis and in political circles about the need to refine the blueprint for Maryland's future and potentially adjust its implementation timeline, particularly considering the state's fiscal situation, which erodes significantly over the next few years. So with so many stakeholders invested in the process, though, any changes are going to be challenging, and balancing the concerns of counties, school boards, educators, policymakers, and a host of other advocates, make this really an incredibly complex task. But discussions are intensifying as pressure builds to ensure the blueprint's success, right? So if there is, if it's true that there is some general consensus that, the General Assembly needs to do something to relieve pressure points, Sarah, what do you think that looks like for Annapolis decision makers? We know it will be incredibly complicated.
Yeah, so from every conversation I've had, and like I sort of alluded to earlier, it's been a lot of them. I've heard that there's a consensus that we need to look at the data and see what that tells us. And I think that can mean a lot of different things for different stakeholders. It could be about the funding. It could be about the metrics of an individual pillar, a process within the plan. But at the end of the day, I think the financial picture and some of the complications outside of the control of the school systems are going to start being considered more heavily. Because inside the blueprint, there's a lot of pieces that are good. I think most people could look at the plan and see how successful that could make every child and teacher if everything came to fruition. But the money to make it happen is what is unclear right now. And that is something that everyone can understand as long as you can more or less count. So the data on my end is the same data everyone else has. So, Annapolis decision makers can see the costs have ballooned a bit. In the first look that we as counties got, the first comprehensive county by county cost each year of the blueprint came in January of 2022. And those were actually numbers, I believe, from August of 2021. And if you compare that forecast to what happened in the most recent budget cycle, the local share calculation from the state was about 338 million more than the January 2022 report. And again, that report's coming up on about 3 years old, and we don't have anything recent to go on for what's to come. And yet, in that 2022 report also showed us that in FY 2030, that forecast had already jumped by about 290 million already. And even still, like, counties have showed up. Almost every county overfunded compared to the local share that was mandated this fiscal 2025 cycle, regardless of that variance. But I think looking ahead, the per pupil funding requirement is scheduled to jump significantly in 2027. So one could presume that the jumps we are already seeing are only going to get bigger. And this is alongside the reality that the revenue growth projected in that January 22 report from DLS did not pan out as hoped. Full-time enrollment is down by a little over 19,000 students from when the original projections were done. And lastly, and Michael touched on this earlier, I think every entity, state or local, got hit by massive shifts in inflation and labor costs over the last couple of years. And I can grant that all of that would have been difficult to forecast. But from what I'm hearing in terms of the conversation around Annapolis, it does sound like everyone understands that we are flying a little bit blind in terms of what the plan really costs and what's possible. And to keep it on the tracks, it probably needs to be looked at. So that's more or less what it's sounding like.
Yeah, and all that makes sense. And I mean, from a county government perspective, I mean, those are big numbers in terms of the original projections versus where we are today. And you're right, counties have gone above and beyond. And really, I mean, for the school boards, it's understandable why they are asking counties in some ways for all this extra money, because counties are the only place they can go, right? They can't go to the state and ask for more money. The state sends the money and that's it. They can go and show up at a county commissioner meeting and bring, you know, their teachers and everyone else and explain why it's so important and why they need the extra money. There's nowhere else for them to go. So counties have stepped up and gone above and beyond, and it's been challenging. And, you know, there are other challenges, right? I mean, if you look at the state's transportation trust fund, billions of dollars in the hole, we rely on that to fund and maintain our local roads. Counties and municipalities own and maintain about 90% of the roads in Maryland. We don't have a local gas tax. The state has the gas tax, and we've been reliant on a portion of that revenue. That revenue has dried up over the years. The state took a bunch of that money back in the Great Recession, and we've never gotten it back. So now we're funding our roads with property taxes, right? People don't think that's the case, but that's the reality. We're also trying to fund the blueprint, right, which is incredibly expensive. We're also dealing with budget challenges locally as well. Everything's more expensive. So counties are really stretched thin. And, you know, we don't have any other way to raise real revenue except for the property tax. Where most Marylanders live, we do have a local income tax, but where, you know, 3/4 of Marylanders live, counties are maxed out on the local income tax. So the only place they can go is to the property tax. So while the state is certainly going to feel the pinch, counties are already feeling the pinch. The state is going to feel it a little bit later, but we have some counties who are right now are really, really struggling to come up with all the cash to do all the things that the state wants us to do. And remember, counties, you know, it has to work at the local level for the blueprint to succeed. And I think the state understands that. I think the state is listening. But Michael, I mean, it's really challenging. And especially when Sarah says, you know, the numbers as originally forecasted have jumped ginormously, and we're only a few years into the rollout. That has to be concerning across the board.
Well, right. And I mean, I know the fiscal inclined staff are aware that the state's overall budget forecast, like they're perpetually creating this sort of 5 or 6 year project out how we look if we just sort of stay the course. And the state puts a lot of effort into a structural balance, looking at ongoing expenditures versus ongoing revenues. And do those numbers balance out, or do we have a shortfall? At the moment, we have a meaningful shortfall. It's probably not overwhelming or insurmountable, but we have a shortfall there. But what definitely happens is once the state gets to where it no longer has money in the trust fund, remember, casino money got put away in an education trust fund by the Maryland voters multiple years before the blueprint got passed and started ramping up. So the state has been paying for their share of this plan basically out of the sock rather than out of cash. And it's just a couple of years down the road in FY 28 when suddenly the costs of the blueprint, which is a big, broad, expensive program, when they've got to pay cash for it, suddenly the state budget looks like it's $3 billion underwater. And that's a big enough number that even the most like wizened and crusty oldsters like me would say, "Wow, that's a big number." So, this is a fiscal issue of consequence as well as very consequential policy, and the state hasn't quite gotten there. But everybody who sits in the room for like the spending affordability committee later this fall and the capital debt affordability committee, they're all going to be hearing about our projections get pretty rough a couple years down the road.
Right, and we've written about that a lot on the blog, and we should plug Sarah's deep dive on education in the blueprint, which we will share in the notes for this show, because you really need to read that. It's a lot of what we're talking about here, even more in depth. Yep. So we've talked about a lot of, everyone's kind of saying it, maybe not on the record, but we know we need to do something. And so let's touch on some of that, because we've had some high profile people talk about that as well. What is the policy conversation? What are you both hearing about, the blueprint right now? I mean, we've already talked about that. A lot of people are saying, we're hearing a lot that we need to make some changes, some tinkering, maybe, adjusting timelines, whatnot. But some big hitters have also weighed on that, and I think it's important to bring context. So, Michael, from your perspective, what have you heard out there that makes you think that maybe we do need to do something? Maybe there is, the legislature does want to and realizes they need to make some changes.
I think so. I get the easy piece here. I would say that among the policy players who sort of chart the course for Annapolis-driven policy, for state-level policy, it's the governor, the Maryland Senate, the Maryland House of Delegates, and it's the governor who's been out on the record talking about this issue, not in a lot of depth, but he has gotten to this specifically, and he's done at least one television interview, and then he was in front of a crowded room at the MACo conference and used a little bit of his time to talk specifically about the blueprint. And so he's made some broad statements about sort of, the situation today isn't what it was when we built the plan. And I know he's used a sort of clever turn of phrase a couple of times about how he's willing to be flexible on the goals, but stubborn on flexible on the means to reach the goals, but stubborn to sticking with the goals themselves. So that sounds an awful lot like we need to look at this. We need to do a fiscal check, and we need to do a timetable check on some of these maybe intermediate deliverables. So I don't know exactly what that looks like, and nobody has put pen to paper and said, here are the 12 things we would change to tidy up the blueprint this year. There's nobody walking around that I know of with a sheet of paper that says that. But if the governor's willing to say in a big open meeting, it's time for us to put everything on the table and get this sorted out, that's a relatively strong signal that this doesn't need to be a third rail type of topic for everybody in town. And that's the way you begin a conversation like that, a serious one.
Yeah, and I guess from my perspective, I'm hearing a lot of people are having conversations, but yeah, that piece of paper that's being circulated about what actually changes, as far as I know, is not in existence yet. But in terms of like what actually gets tweaked, I mean, I'm hearing a lot of different things. Some of it is around whether it's time to take a look at stretching out the timeline. Some other things were around whether adjusting the goals makes sense. Others talk about if we need to establish some more metrics for success. I don't know, it's already pretty metrics heavy, I feel like. And some of the conversation is about identifying sustainable revenue streams at the state and local level for it. So it's a little bit all over the place, but those conversations are ongoing. But at the end of the day, the plan holds a ton of promise, but if resources get stretched too thin, you can't exactly realize fully any of the goals. So I think honing in on the real costs, sufficient revenue streams, and maybe slightly more narrow goals sound like they could all be potentially on the table from what I'm hearing.
Yeah, so we'll see. I mean, I think there is generally people acknowledge they need to do something, but trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube on some of these goals will be incredibly difficult. And for a lot of reasons, there are a lot of fervent advocates who believe strongly in this stuff. And there's a lot of good stuff in the blueprint. And no one is saying we don't want to do these things, but the fiscal reality check is going to be needed, I think, in this year's session. So we've talked about a lot of the problems with the rollout. We've gone through, where we are. I want to end on a positive note, and let's touch on some bright spots and opportunities when it comes to the blueprint. So Sarah, I'm going to ask you first, what excites you about the blueprint, and where is there opportunity that's really going to be transformational for a lot of kids in Maryland?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the plan is truly visionary. I mean, and the economic engine it promises could really be, like you said, transformative and pay serious dividends in real life values for residents and the economy. I think there's no question about that. And just because things are hard doesn't mean they aren't worth striving for. But I think from an opportunity perspective, like I said before, if the resources are stretched too thin, the staff is pushed too hard, and the systems aren't fully in place, you run the risk of it falling apart. And I don't think anybody wants that. So I think it's visionary, but recalibration is sort of an opportunity to see that vision through ultimately. I don't know, Michael, what do you think?
I think I agree that, I mean, the tenor of where we want to be is pretty inspiring, broadly speaking. I think to some degree, we just spent some time at a conference with some of our counterparts from the southern states, the southeastern region of the state associations, and I was in sort of a heated conversation with some of our counterparts from deep southern states, sort of about the difference in philosophy with economic development and taxes and other things like that. And I think one of the things that I sort of said is, Maryland probably just doesn't win the race to the bottom, along with if Alabama is going to tell the manufacturer, build your plant here, you won't have any trouble with unions, you can dump the acid right into the streams, and you'll get a tax break for 35 years, and it's going to be super cheap on cheap land, and we'll give you this super big handout for your big manufacturing plant. I suspect on a certain level, Maryland isn't going to compete for that prize. But the way we compete is by leaning into what we do well. We have an extremely educated workforce, but to the extent that we can churn out waves and waves of students who become workers, who have apprenticeships, and they're on their way to having trade skills, who have technical familiarity, who have an excellent grounding to become highly productive workers, for can attract that way. That's when Governor Moore says this is the way Maryland wins. I think it's through this kind of thing, and the public schools are a foundation for that sort of thing. I would say, honestly, the best thing that could happen for fans of the blueprint would be that a metric everybody understands comes along sometime soon, and we look at, one of the first things we poured money into was schools that have a high density of poverty. So it's not just a few poor kids, it's lots of poor kids in one dense school. Let's put more resources into those schools. Let's get some wraparound services. Let's try and get more kids into Head Start and get them full bellies so they can learn in the morning and so forth. What if the investment in those schools, if we found, hey, 16 schools got this first wave of blueprint investments, and here they come. Those kids are now taking the 3rd grade test, they're taking the 8th grade test, and their numbers are better. Everybody could feel it. Everybody could see it. You could spike the football a little bit and say, see, we're pointed in the right direction. I think that could be just almost like a political win for the process, that what we're doing is going to pay off. Bits and pieces will show up quickly, but a bunch of it will be on the back end. That's why you do it.
Yeah, no doubt. And, interesting, Michael, that conversation about the race to the bottom. We're certainly not going to compete there, but, this is visionary. And if everything comes into fruition, I'm confident that, it will have a major effect on Maryland, on the economy, on our quality of life, and to have, to build on an already educated workforce. We have a great university system here. We have great hospitals here. We're proximity to DC. We can build upon that, and we can compete with any other state. And so it's going to be a bit of a waiting game, but I agree with you, Michael. If we had a metric that could really, invigorate people and show people that this is working, and sort of excite the base and get people fired up. And also, I have to plug, find out a way to pay for it, right? We need to address that at the state and the local level. Then I think we can really do great things with this program. So we'll see. And in the coming months, we're going to have a clearer sense of where Annapolis stands on education policy leading into the 2025 session. And of course, once we have that direction, our audience and stakeholders will be informed shortly after, and that'll set the stage for further discussions, especially at the upcoming MACo Winter Conference. I talked about it a little bit earlier. It's December 11th through the 13th at the Hyatt Regency Chesapeake Bay Hotel in Cambridge, Maryland, which is, of course, located in beautiful Dorchester County. We take over that property. MACo owns that property during the conference. We're the only ones there. It's just people running around everywhere, but the whole hotel is the MACo conference, and it offers a prime opportunity for policymakers to come together and tackle key issues before the session picks up momentum. It's the perfect time to get ahead of the curve and collaborate on solutions. Michael and Sarah, I think that we're going to have substantive conversations about the blueprint, especially in December as we're leading up to session. Maybe we'll have some more information, but I expect that to be a major theme of the conference leading into session.
Yes, I think we'll be able to count on that.
It has to be, right? It's on everybody's mind. So this is going to be not only in the program and at the panel of people at the front of the room, and hopefully we'll get leaders talking to our elected officials and so forth, but it's also going to be the chatter when you're having lunch with your neighboring county and comparing notes on where you are and so forth. And this is the number one thing folks are talking about. We got lots of issues. The things that face county governments are broad and complicated, but this is the biggest and most consequential among them.
All right, so we'll make sure that you have links for the conference. We'll have links to Sarah's great work on the blog and anything else you need in the show notes.
One more thing before we go. If you're planning to attend the MACo Winter Conference at the Hyatt Regency Chesapeake Bay Hotel in Cambridge, Maryland, this December 11th through 13th, we've got some important updates for you. First off, we know the Hyatt fills up fast, and staying in the hotel really enhances that conference experience. So we're changing things up this year to make sure everyone has a fair shot at securing their room. Hotel reservations will now be part of the registration process, which means you must be registered as an attendee or an exhibitor to book a room. This helps prevent overbooking and those last-minute cancellations that can throw a wrench in our plans. Don't worry, though. We'll be announcing the registration details, including exhibit and hotel room rates, very soon. This will give everyone enough time to get those approvals lined up before registration opens. Speaking of which, registration will open in phases. First for county elected officials, then for county staff and MACo corporate partners, followed by sponsors and exhibitors, and then for everyone else. We've also secured a secondary hotel just across the street, and we'll have a shuttle running between the two. So you'll be taken care of no matter where you stay. To stay in the loop, make sure to keep an eye on our website and blog, and sign up for conference updates at mdcounties.org/subscribe. Stay tuned.
Well, we're going to go ahead and leave it there for today. If you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, be reading the Conduit Street blog every single day, always content rolling. But for Sarah Sample, Michael Sanderson, and our esteemed producer, Chantel Malcolm Lynn, this is Kevin Canale signing off, and we will talk to you soon.